The book hit the floor before she could stop it. Clara Voss stood in the doorway of the Harlan ranch house, with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, staring at the man in the bed, who had just thrown the novel across the room with his one good arm. The other arm was wrapped tight against his chest in a splint, and his face was the color of old ash, and his eyes were burning with something far more dangerous than fever. "Get out," Leland Cross said. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it hit her like a slap. "I don't need you. I don't need anybody reading to me like I'm some kind of invalid child. Take your book and get out of my house." Clara did not move. She was 24 years old and had survived enough hardship to know that a man saying "get out" and a man meaning "get out" were sometimes two entirely different things. She looked at him, at the gaunt hollows under his cheekbones, at the dark bruising still spreading from his collarbone down into the bandaging across his ribs, at the way his chest rose and fell in short, careful increments because breathing too deeply still hurt him, and she made a decision. She walked across the room, bent down, and picked up the book. "Leland," she said quietly, "you haven't eaten since this morning. You've got a fever that your ranch hand tells me was 103 degrees last night. And the doctor said, if you don't rest without fighting everyone who comes near you, that infection in your shoulder is going to take your arm, and possibly the rest of you along with it." "Then let it," he said. The words dropped into the silence of the room like stones into deep water, and Clara felt the chill of them move through her. This was not anger. This was something darker. This was a man who had decided, somewhere behind those burning gray eyes, that it might not matter whether he lived or died. She had not expected that when she agreed to come here. She had not expected any of this. 3 weeks earlier, Clara Voss had been a schoolteacher in the small town of Millhaven, Texas, in the spring of 1883, with a rented room above the dry goods store and a schedule as predictable as the sunrise. She taught reading and arithmetic to the children of ranchers and farmers and the occasional merchant family, and she spent her evenings reading by lamplight and writing long letters to her sister in Kansas that she sometimes sent and sometimes did not. Her life was quiet in the way that a life can be quiet, when it has been deliberately arranged to avoid the kind of pain that comes from wanting things. She had wanted things once. She had wanted them badly enough that the loss of them had nearly broken her, and so she had come to Millhaven from Fort Worth 2 years ago and built herself a careful, contained existence where no one could disappoint her and nothing could fall apart. Then Sheriff Aldous Prentice had come to the schoolhouse on a Tuesday morning and asked her, with his hat in his hands and genuine distress on his weathered face, if she would be willing to help with a situation that had gotten beyond the town's immediate capacity to manage. "It's Leland Cross," the sheriff had said. "You know who he is." Everyone in Millhaven knew who Leland Cross was, the way everyone in a small town knows who the largest landowner is. The Cross Ranch, 5,000 acres of cattle land on the eastern edge of Millhaven County, was the oldest established operation in the region, and Leland Cross had run it since his father died 8 years ago when he was 26 years old. He was 34 now, and he was unmarried, and he employed 9 men, and he was, by every account Clara had ever heard, a man of almost rigid self-sufficiency. He did not ask for help. He did not accept charity. He paid his debts on time, and he kept to himself, and the town respected him in the distant, slightly awed way that people respect a mountain. He had an accident, the sheriff said. Cattle stampede, 3 weeks past. One of his hired men got spooked by lightning and fired a shot that set the whole herd running. Leland was in the middle of it trying to redirect them away from the south fence. Horse went down, he got. The sheriff paused as though searching for a word that was not too brutal. He got hit. Badly. Broken collarbone, broken arm, 4 broken ribs, and a cut on his shoulder that Dr. Ferris is worried about because it's not healing the way it should. "I'm sorry to hear that," Clara said, "but I don't understand what it has to do with me." "He's alone out there," the sheriff said. "His ranch hands can manage the cattle, but nobody's seeing to him. He won't hire a nurse. He won't let Dr. Ferris come more than once a week. He sent away 2 women from the church who volunteered to bring food, and he threw a boot at the pastor when he came to pray over him." "He threw a boot at the pastor," Clara repeated. "The pastor was not injured," the sheriff said, with the faint expression of a man who had considered laughing at the time and was still considering it now. "Listen, Miss Voss. The man is going to die out there from pure stubbornness if someone doesn't get through to him. Dr. Ferris thinks the infection in his shoulder is getting worse. He needs someone to sit with him, make sure he eats, keep his fever monitored, and—" The sheriff looked slightly uncomfortable. The doctor suggested that if someone could keep him calm and occupied, it might help. He mentioned reading. Leland used to read, apparently, when he was younger. Before everything. Clara had looked at the sheriff for a long moment. She had her class to think about. She had her carefully constructed quiet life to think about. She had very good reasons for not getting involved with a difficult, wounded, isolated man who apparently threw things at people who tried to help him. "I'll go," she said. "Starting tomorrow morning, I can have one of the older girls manage the class for the reading hour." She was never able to explain, afterward, exactly why she said yes. Maybe it was the phrase "before everything." Maybe it was the image of a man lying alone in a ranch house getting sicker while he refused to let anyone near enough to save him. Maybe it was something in her that recognized, with painful clarity, the particular loneliness of a person who had decided they did not deserve to be cared for. Whatever the reason, she packed a bag with her 2 favorite books, and a supply of clean linen and a jar of her aunt's recipe for fever tea, and she rode out to the Cross Ranch the next morning in a borrowed wagon. The first 3 days were the ones she would later describe to her sister as educational. He called her a busybody on the first day. He told her on the second day that he had sent for the sheriff to have her removed, which she had called his bluff on by pointing out that the sheriff had been the one to send her. On the third day he had asked, with what appeared to be genuine bafflement, why she was still there. "Because you're sick," she said simply, setting a bowl of broth on the table beside his bed. "And because no one should be sick and alone." He stared at her as though she had said something in a foreign language. She went about her business, straightening the medicines on the dresser and opening the window slightly to let fresh air into the stuffy room. And she did not push him or pry, or try to fill the silence with meaningless comfort. She had learned, from years of teaching children who had been hurt in ways that adults pretended not to see, that the most important thing you could sometimes do for a wounded creature was simply to stay. On the evening of the 4th day, she was sitting in the chair beside his bed. He was sleeping, or at least pretending to, and she took out the book she had brought. It was a copy of Jane Eyre, worn soft with handling, and she opened it and began to read quietly to herself. She was not even consciously reading aloud at first. It was simply a habit, formed from years of reading to children, that she sometimes slipped into without noticing when she was absorbed. She had been reading for perhaps 10 minutes when she realized he was watching her. She looked up. His gray eyes were open, looking at her with an expression she could not entirely name. It was not quite the hostility she had gotten used to. It was something more complicated. Wary and curious, and something beneath both of those things that she decided not to examine too closely. "I was reading aloud," she said. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to disturb you." "You weren't," he said, after a pause so long she had thought he wasn't going to answer at all. "Disturbing me." She looked down at the book, then back at him. He had not looked away. "Would you like me to start from the beginning?" she asked. The silence stretched again. The lamp between them was turned low, casting warm amber light across his sharp features and the line of bandaging white against his neck. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere in the hills and then went quiet. "If you want," he said. She found the first page. She settled back in the chair, and she began to read. That was how it started. She came every evening after that, arriving in time to check on his fever and the state of his shoulder, dressing with the careful efficiency she had developed over the first 4 days. And then, after he had eaten, he was eating better now, she noticed, as though the routine had given him something to organize himself around. She would open the book and read. He never asked her to. He never said he liked it. But she could see the difference in him when she was reading versus when she was not. The way the rigid set of his jaw slowly loosened, the way his breathing evened out and deepened, the way the feverish restlessness that made him thrash and fight with the blankets seemed to quiet down to something almost peaceful. Dr. Ferris came on the 6th day after she had started reading to him, and stood in the doorway looking between Clara and his patient with an expression of cautious astonishment. "His fever is down," the doctor said to Clara, outside the room afterward. "It was holding steady at 102 for a week. Yesterday it was 100 even. Today it's 99. And his shoulder," he shook his head. "It's still a concern, but the redness has stopped spreading. Whatever you're doing, Miss Voss, don't stop." "I'm reading to him," she said. The doctor looked at her. "Beg pardon, Jane Eyre," she said. "In the evenings." The doctor appeared to struggle with something in his expression and then appeared to give up and simply look grateful. "Well," he said, "whatever works." The evenings became the part of Clara's day. She did not let herself think about too much, because thinking about them too directly made her aware of things she was not prepared to examine. The way, for instance, that Leland had started looking at the door around the time she usually arrived, and the way his expression when she came through it was carefully neutral in the way that an expression is carefully neutral when a person is working to conceal what it would otherwise show. The way he had begun to ask questions about the book during the reading, small questions at first, interruptions that were less interruptions and more like windows opening. And the way those questions were slowly revealing the shape of a mind that was sharp and curious, and had, it seemed, been kept deliberately unused. "She stays with him," he said one evening after she had read the scene where Jane refuses to become Rochester's mistress, "even though it would be easier to go." "She leaves, actually," Clara said. "She doesn't stay, not yet. But she doesn't stop loving him," he said. He was looking at the ceiling. "Even when she goes." "No," Clara said. "She doesn't stop." The silence between them after she said it had a different quality than the silences she had gotten used to. It sat heavily, charged with something unspoken, and Clara carefully looked down at the book and turned the page and began reading again before either of them had to acknowledge what they had both noticed. The harder thing, the thing she found herself lying awake thinking about in her rented room above the dry goods store on the evenings she did not stay late, was not that she was becoming attached to him. She had expected, in a clinical way, that there would be some degree of emotional involvement in caring for someone this consistently. What she had not expected was the particular nature of that attachment, the way it felt less like the professional warmth of a caretaker, and more like the terrifying, unwelcome recognition of a person who has been lonely for a long time and suddenly finds themselves in the presence of someone who understands what that feels like. Because Leland Cross was lonely in exactly the way Clara Voss was lonely, which was not the simple loneliness of isolation, but the loneliness of a person who has decided to be alone rather than survive another loss. She discovered this gradually and almost despite herself, because he was not a man who offered information about himself easily. He told her things in the way that a locked box sometimes falls open, suddenly, and only when something specific shifts the mechanism. The first thing he told her that mattered was that his father had died of a fever not unlike the one currently inhabiting Leland himself. He said this one evening when she was checking his temperature, and the thermometer read 101 degrees, and she saw the flash of something that looked like fear move across his face before the neutrality snapped back down over it. "He died in this bed," Leland said. His voice was flat and informational and entirely unconvincing. "My father, in this exact room." Clara held the thermometer and looked at him, and understood suddenly why he had fought so hard against being confined to this room and this bed. Why being cared for here felt like being prepared for death. "It's not the same fever," she said carefully, "and you're not the same man." "No," he said. "He was a better man than me." She wanted to argue that. She did not, because she knew it would not help, and because she suspected that the particular guilt he carried about his father was one of the pieces of the hidden past that was keeping him pinned in place like a butterfly on a card. She filed it away instead, something to come back to when the time was right. The second thing he told her was about a woman named Leland, and this one came out very differently, not flat and controlled, but in pieces over the course of several evenings, as though it kept leaking out in spite of himself. Leland had been the daughter of a rancher from the next county over. She and Leland had known each other since they were children, and when she was 18 and he was 22, they had begun what everyone in both counties had assumed was the straightforward beginning of a marriage. They had been courting for almost 2 years when she had left with a cattle buyer from San Antonio, a man she had apparently known for less than 3 weeks. She and Leland had been planning a wedding. She had never explained. She had simply gone. This was 10 years ago, and the wound of it had calcified into something that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but was enormously load-bearing in the structure of who Leland Cross had become. Clara could see it in everything, in his fierce self-sufficiency, in his refusal to let anyone close enough to matter, in the particular way he turned the rejection of care into a point of pride. She did not tell him she saw it. She did not push. She simply read to him every evening and brought his food and checked his fever and asked about the ranch, because she had discovered that asking about the cattle and the land was the surest way to get him talking, and she waited. "My father always said the land doesn't forgive stupidity," he told her on a Wednesday evening, about 2 weeks into her nightly visits, after she had asked about the south pasture. "But it does forgive failure if you're willing to work it. You can have a bad year and come back from it. You just have to stay." "That's true of most things," Clara said. He looked at her. The evening light was golden and long through the window, and his fever had been below 100 for 3 days, and the color was starting to come back into his face, and she was aware of him in a way that she was finding increasingly difficult to manage. He was not conventionally handsome in the way of the men she had noticed when she was younger. He was something different, angular and worn, with the kind of face that told the story of the life it had lived. She found she looked at him too long sometimes and had to consciously redirect her attention. "You're from Fort Worth," he said. It was not a question. He had pieces of her story by now the same way she had pieces of his. "I was," she said, "before Mill Haven." "Why Mill Haven?" It was the direct version of a question he had been circling for days, and she had known it would arrive eventually. She was quiet for a moment, deciding how honest to be. "I needed somewhere quiet," she said finally. "Somewhere I could," she paused. "Rebuild, I suppose." He was watching her with the same careful attention he gave to the book sometimes, reading the things beneath the words. Rebuild from what? She folded her hands in her lap and looked at them. She thought about the doctor she had been engaged to in Fort Worth, who had turned out to have a different version of himself for every woman he spoke to, and the particular devastation of discovering, on the eve of your own wedding, that the person you had been building your future around was not quite real. From a mistake I made, she said, about a person I thought I knew. Someone hurt you, Leland said. His voice was very quiet. She looked up, and the expression on his face was not pity, which she would have resisted, but something that looked almost like understanding. The shared recognition of two people who know the same kind of wound. Yes, she said simply. The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had come before it. It was warmer, somehow. The kind of silence that happens between people who have stopped pretending. I should keep reading, she said eventually, picking up the book. Yes, he said. He settled back against his pillows. You should. But as she read, she was very aware that his gray eyes were not always on the ceiling the way they usually were, and that when she glanced up at him through her lashes, not on purpose, just the involuntary glances that had become habit over these weeks, he was sometimes looking at her with an expression that was not at all like the hostility she had started with, or even the wariness that had followed it. It was something quieter and more serious and considerably more frightening. Dr. Ferris came again on the 17th day and stood at the bedside with an expression of professional delight mixed with bewilderment. You're healing remarkably, the doctor said to Leland, examining the shoulder. Remarkably. The infection is nearly resolved. I wouldn't have bet on this 3 weeks ago, Cross. I won't deceive you. 3 weeks ago I thought you might lose this arm. I wasn't going to lose my arm, Leland said. You absolutely were, the doctor said cheerfully. Whatever Miss Voss has done. She read to me, Leland said, with the flat, uninflected delivery he used when he wanted to cut off a line of inquiry. The doctor looked at Clara. Well, he said, keep reading. After the doctor left, Clara sat in the chair by the window while Leland moved experimentally, testing the range of motion in the shoulder the way he had been doing with increasing frequency over the past few days. The arm was out of the splint now, though he had been told not to use it for anything strenuous. He says another week and you could be out of bed, Clara said. She was watching him with a feeling she did not entirely examine. Something between gladness and loss, which did not make logical sense and which she was choosing not to pursue. I've been out of bed, Leland said. He had been, in fact, increasingly insistent on walking the length of the room on his own. She had watched him do it with her heart in her throat the first time, when he had gone pale and had to grab the bedpost, and with considerably less alarm now that he could do it without the color draining from his face. I know, she said. I mean out of this room, back to the ranch. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. And you'll stop coming, he said. It was not a question. She met his eyes and found that looking directly at him was harder than it used to be. I have the class, she said. I've been managing it with half a schedule for nearly a month. The children need. Yes, he said. I know. He turned to look out the window. The ranch spread out below it in the long afternoon light, the grass golden, the cattle visible in the far south pasture as small, moving, dark shapes. I know you have your life to get back to. There was something in his voice that she could not let go unaddressed. She stood up from the chair and walked to the window and stood beside him, not quite touching, looking out at the land. It doesn't have to end, she said carefully. The reading. I could come in the evening still if... She stopped. She was aware that she was offering something under the cover of practicality that was not actually about practicality at all. If you wanted to finish the book, she added, which was not quite what she meant. He turned to look at her. They were very close, standing at the window, closer than they usually were except when she was tending the dressing on his shoulder, and she was conscious of his height, and the warmth that came off him and the way the gray of his eyes had this quality in certain light of looking very deep. "I'd like to finish the book," he said quietly. "Good," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She went home that evening in the borrowed wagon with the smell of the evening air around her, and the sound of her own heartbeat unreasonably loud in her ears. And she sat in her room above the dry goods store and looked at the second book she had packed in her bag 3 weeks ago and never opened. And she thought very seriously about what she was doing. She was not supposed to be doing this. She had come to Millhaven specifically to avoid doing this. The whole structure of her life here had been built around the principle that she would not allow herself to be drawn into the particular kind of danger that came from caring too much about a particular person, because she knew from painful experience that caring too much gave that person the power to take something from you that could not be replaced. She had been careful for 2 years. She had been so careful. And then, one wounded cattleman had thrown a book across a room and looked at her with burning gray eyes and said, "Get out." And she had stayed. And now she was sitting here thinking about the sound of his voice when he said, "I'd like to finish the book," and feeling as though the carefully constructed walls of her careful, contained life had developed a crack that was growing by the day. She did not sleep very well that night. He was in the chair by the window when she arrived the next evening, sitting up, fully dressed for the first time since she had met him, in a clean shirt with the collar open. It altered him somehow, seeing him out of the sick bed. She had known, in the abstract, that he would be a different kind of physical presence when he was not confined to lying down, but she had underestimated what that difference would be. He was tall. She had known that from the handful of times he had stood, and broad across the shoulders, and when he rose from the chair as she came in, the movement was careful but entirely present, as though the body that had been fighting fever and infection for the past weeks was remembering what it was for. "You don't have to stand," she said. "I know," he said, and did not sit back down. She put down her bag and looked at him. He looked back at her. The evening light was just coming through the window behind him. "You look better," she said, because it was true and because she needed to say something that was not the thing she was actually thinking. "I feel better," he said. "Dr. Ferris was here this morning. He says I can go out to the yard tomorrow if I'm careful." "That's good news," she said. "Yes," he said. He was still looking at her with that careful, serious attention that she had come to recognize over the past weeks. "Clara." It was the first time he had used her given name without the miss in front of it, and the absence of the formal syllable was startling in a way she had not prepared for. "Yes," she said. "I need to say something before you start reading," he said. "Because if I wait until you start reading, I'll lose the nerve for it." She put the book down on the table and waited. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working through something, choosing words with the same careful deliberateness he seemed to bring to everything. He moved to the window and stood looking out for a moment, then turned back to her. "You came here because the sheriff asked you to," he said. "I know that. I've given you no good reason to stay. I threw your book across the room. I told you to leave more times than I can count." He paused. "I have not been." Another pause, and she could see that this was a man who did not have easy access to the language of this kind of thing. "I have not been easy." "No," she agreed. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but close. "And you stayed anyway." "I stayed anyway," she said. He met her eyes. Why? She thought about the many careful answers she could give to that question. The professional ones, the practical ones, the ones that would keep her safe behind the walls she had spent 2 years building. "Because I think you're worth staying for," she said instead. The silence after that was very long. Outside, somewhere on the ranch, one of the hands called out to another and a horse answered, and the evening insects were beginning their slow chorus in the grass, and the light through the window was turning the deep amber of late evening. "I haven't been worth much," Leland said, very quietly. "To yourself, maybe," she said. "That's different from being worth it to someone else." He looked at her for what felt like a long time. Something moved across his face that she had not seen there before. Not the guarded neutrality, not the pain, not the fever-bright intensity. Something more vulnerable than any of those things and more real. "Clara," he said again. Just her name, just that. "Leland," she said. He crossed the room in 3 slow steps. Careful, because the ribs were still healing, because the shoulder was still tender. And when he was standing directly in front of her, he stopped, and he looked at her, and she had the distinct sensation of standing at the edge of something with the choice of whether to step back or forward entirely and completely before her. She did not step back. He raised his hand, the one that was not the injured arm, and very carefully, very slowly, touched her face. Just the backs of his fingers against her cheek, a touch so gentle it barely registered as pressure, as though she was something that might startle. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I haven't. It's been a long time since I wanted to know how." "I don't know how either," she said honestly. "I've forgotten most of what I knew." "Then we're starting from the same place," he said. She reached up and covered his hand with hers. His hand was large and rough from the work of years, and hers was smaller and softer, and they fit together with a kind of naturalness that made her breath catch. "Read to me," he said softly. "Tonight. One more time. I want—" He paused again, searching. "I want to hear how it ends." She stepped back just enough to pick up the book, and she sat in the chair, and he settled himself into the window seat across from her, and she opened Jane Eyre to the place where she had left off, and she read. She read about Jane returning to Thornfield, and finding it burned to the ruin, and her voice was steady even though her heart was not entirely. She read about the search, about the finding, about the reunion of 2 people who had thought they had lost each other to pride and principle and the darkness of hidden truths. And when she came to the line reader, "I married him," she had to pause for a moment, because something about the simplicity of it, the absolute, uncomplicated directness of it, had closed her throat. "Go on," Leland said quietly. She went on. When she finished, the room was nearly dark, and she closed the book and sat with it in her lap, and neither of them said anything for a while. The silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that had evolved between them over weeks into something that did not need to be filled. "Good ending," Leland said at last. "Yes," she agreed. She waited, he said. "Jane." Even when she didn't know it was going to be all right, she waited for the right thing rather than the easy one. "She did," Clara said. "I've been thinking," Leland said, "about the kind of man I've been for the last 10 years, and about whether it's too late to be a different kind." Clara set the book on the table and looked at him in the low lamplight. He was watching her with the direct, unguarded attention she had learned to recognize as the truest version of him, the one that lived underneath the armor. "It's not too late," she said. "It's never too late to begin again." He nodded slowly as though accepting a verdict. "I'd like to come to your school," he said. "Next week when I can ride. I'd like to. There are books in the county I haven't seen. I don't know if you noticed, but I don't have many here." She smiled at that. "I noticed." "I thought maybe you could recommend what I should get," he said. And then, if it wasn't, he stopped and started again. "There's a supper that Mrs. Aldous holds at the church on Fridays. I've never gone, but I thought if you were going, Leland," she said. He stopped. "Yes," she said. "To all of it?" "Yes." The smile that moved across his face then was not the careful, controlled expression she had been cataloging over the weeks. It was real, and it changed his face completely. and she felt the sight of it somewhere deep in her chest, in the place where she had been keeping the thing she was not examining directly. He rode into town for the first time the following week, and he came to the schoolhouse after the children had left, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands looking at the rows of small desks, with an expression she could not immediately read. "What are you thinking?" she asked, looking up from straightening the papers on her desk. "I came to a schoolhouse like this," he said, "when I was young, before my father needed me on the ranch." He moved into the room, running one hand along the top of the desks as he walked between the rows. "I liked it. I liked reading. My father thought it was a waste of time." "Reading is never a waste of time," she said firmly. He looked at her over the desk between them. "No," he said, "I know that now." They walked to the small general store together in the afternoon light, and he bought 3 books on her recommendation: a collection of essays, a novel she loved, and a book of poetry that she thought, from the way he had responded to the language in Jane Eyre, he might take to unexpectedly. He carried them under his arm as they walked back up the main street of Millhaven, and people they passed looked at them with the undisguised curiosity of a small town that had opinions and no particular reason not to express them. Mrs. Harrington, who ran the boarding house and was the closest thing Millhaven had to a social authority, stopped on the boardwalk and looked at the two of them with an expression that mixed surprise and calculation. "Mr. Cross," she said, "we didn't expect to see you up and about so soon. How are you feeling?" "Well," he said, "thank you. And Miss Voss?" Her eyes moved between them with the careful assessment of a woman who has been gathering information about the social landscape for 40 years. "I understand you've been very devoted in your care of Mr. Cross." "I have been doing what was needed," Clara said. Mrs. Harrington's gaze rested on the books under Leland's arm and the comfortable proximity between the two of them, and came to whatever conclusion it was always going to come to. "Well, we'll see you at Friday supper, I suppose." "Both of us," Leland said, with a directness that made Mrs. Harrington's eyebrows rise nearly into her hairline. "Wonderful," she said, and moved on with the expression of a woman who had a great deal to tell several specific people before the end of the day. Clara looked up at Leland as they walked on. He was looking straight ahead, but there was something at the corner of his mouth. "Was that intentional?" she asked. "Both of us?" "Yes," he said simply. The Friday supper was both better and worse than Clara had anticipated. Better because Leland, freed from the confined space of the sick room and the focused vulnerability that illness had imposed, turned out to be quietly articulate and capable of genuine social warmth when he chose to apply it. Worse because half the town was watching them with a focused attention that she found exhausting, and he seemed to find entirely irrelevant. "They're all staring," she murmured to him during the meal, behind the cover of picking up her fork. "I know," he said, without lowering his voice at all. "Let them." She laughed, which surprised her, and the laugh surprised him visibly, and the moment of mutual surprise made something between them shift again into a new configuration. After supper, in the cooling evening air, he walked her back to the dry goods store. The street was quiet. Overhead, the sky was enormous and full of stars in the particular extravagant way of the Texas sky, and their footsteps on the boardwalk were the only sound. At the door to her stair, he stopped. "I have something I need to tell you," he said. He was looking at her very directly. "About Alina." She was quiet, waiting. "What I said before, that she left because she wanted something I couldn't give her, that's what I told myself for 10 years, he said. "But I've been thinking about it differently lately. The truth is that I was not present. I was so caught up in the ranch, in my father's death, in trying to hold everything together that I was not there. Not really. She tried to tell me and I didn't hear her." He paused. I'm not excusing what she did, but it was not entirely her fault. Clara looked at him. That took a great deal of honesty, she said. You've been honest with me, he said. It seemed right to return it. The man who hurt me, she said slowly, who made me come to Millhaven and make myself small and quiet, he wasn't honest, not about anything. And I missed all the signs because I wanted so badly to believe in what I thought I had. She met Leland's eyes. I used to think that was stupidity. Now I think it was just hope. Hope isn't stupid, it just needs to be pointed at the right place. Clara, he said. Yes, she said. I would like very much to court you properly, he said. If you're willing. The dinners and the walking and he stopped, and something that might have been color moved up his neck. All of it, properly. She felt warmth move through her chest, wide and steady as a river. I am willing, she said. Very willing. He took her hand, there in the lamplight of the Millhaven street, with half the town probably watching from behind their curtains, and held it for a moment. His grip was warm and careful and entirely sure. Then we'll begin, he said. They began. The courtship that followed had the quality of something being built with great care and genuine attention, which was different from anything either of them had done before, because they were both people who had been burned and both people who had rebuilt themselves around the wound, and they approached the process of becoming close to each other with a combination of intentionality and terrified hope that was sometimes funny and sometimes achingly tender. He came to town twice a week, on Wednesday evenings and Saturday afternoons. On Wednesdays they walked and talked, sometimes for 2 hours, in the evenings when the town was quiet. He had started reading the books she had recommended, and he wanted, every time, to tell her what he thought of them. And his thoughts were careful and specific, and sometimes surprising. He read the poetry book in 3 days, and then came to town with 6 small notations on a folded piece of paper where he had marked lines that struck him as particularly true. She loved those conversations in a way she found hard to explain. There was the quality of a real meeting of minds in them, and she had not had that in a long time. On Saturdays, she sometimes rode out to the ranch with him, and he showed her the land, the pastures and the creek and the ridge line to the east where, on clear days, you could see 40 miles, and he talked about it in a way that was entirely different from how he talked about anything else. The ranch was where Leland Cross was most himself. She could see it in how he moved on it, in how he spoke about it, in the way the tension he carried everywhere else in his body seemed to release when he was standing on his own land looking at his own cattle. She told him about her childhood in Fort Worth, about her mother who had died when Clara was 12, and her father who had raised her with more love than practical ability, and her sister, who was the organized, sensible one, and had gone to Kansas and married a farmer and was contentedly managing a household and 4 children, while Clara had gone the completely opposite direction. She told him about learning to read from a woman in her neighborhood who had a library of unusual size for the time and place, and how that woman's death had left the library to Clara, and how the books had been the most important inheritance she had ever received. She told him about the doctor in Fort Worth, eventually, in more detail than she had given before. She told him about the discovery, a letter, of all things, that she had not been supposed to find, from a woman in Dallas who seemed to be under the impression that Dr. Morris Ingram was planning to marry her in the spring, which had been the same spring in which Morris Ingram was planning to marry Clara Voss. She told him about the confrontation, the denials, the eventual admission, the broken engagement, the shattering of everything she had thought her future would be. Leland listened to all of it without interrupting, and without offering the kind of performative sympathy that would have felt hollow. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said simply, "He was a fool and a coward." Yes, she said. He was. His loss, Leland said, looking at her steadily, in the most complete sense. She looked away from him, out at the long grass moving in the afternoon wind, because the way he said it made the warmth in her chest so acute it was hard to look at him. Leland, she said. Clara, he said. She turned back. He was very close. The afternoon sun was warm on her back, and the land was quiet around them, except for the wind and the distant sound of cattle and the particular hush of a moment that is about to become something it has not been before. He kissed her very gently, with one hand curved against her jaw, on the ridge that looked out over 40 miles of Texas. It was the kind of kiss that is not a beginning and not an end but a confirmation. The moment when something that has been building quietly for weeks finally says, plainly, what it is. She kissed him back and felt something in herself that had been held very carefully for a very long time finally, with a slow exhale, let go. The weeks that followed had a warmth to them that she had not felt in years, possibly ever. He sent her notes by the ranch hand who came to town for supplies, short notes, carefully written, which said things like, "The North Pasture Creek is full from the rain and I thought you would like to see it." Or, "I finished the essays and I want to know what you think of the last one," or simply, "Wednesday seems a long way away." She kept them in the drawer of her writing desk and took them out more often than she would have admitted to anyone. She was happy, and the happiness had the quality of something slightly unbelievable, the way things that have been hoped for very quietly for a long time can feel almost fictional when they actually arrive. She kept waiting for the mechanism to fail, for the trap to spring, for the hidden thing to reveal itself the way hidden things always had in her experience. She watched for the ways he might not be what he seemed. He was exactly what he seemed. That was perhaps the thing about Leland Cross that she found most extraordinary. He was not a simple man, and he was not an uncomplicated one. He carried his losses and his failures with him the way men of his kind always do, openly and without pretense, as though he had given up somewhere along the way on the idea of appearing to be anything other than what he was. He was sharp and sometimes difficult and occasionally still prone to a kind of quiet withdrawal when something got too close too fast. But he was honest, radically, consistently, almost brutally honest, with her, with himself, with everyone. In early July, nearly 3 months after she had first ridden out to the Cross Ranch in a borrowed wagon with 2 books and a jar of fever tea, Leland came to town on a Wednesday evening and asked, instead of walking, if she would come with him to a place he wanted to show her. He drove the wagon himself. His arm was fully healed now, the shoulder recovered, the ribs long since mended, and took her out east of town to a wide, flat piece of land that backed up against the creek and had a line of old cottonwood trees along the water. The evening sun was enormous and orange over the western horizon, and the light on the cottonwood leaves was extraordinary, and Clara stood in the wagon bed looking at it while Leland hopped down and came around to help her down. "This is not your land," she said, looking around. "Not yet," he said. "It's Perkins's land from the east section. Old man Perkins has been wanting to sell for 2 years. Nobody's made him the right offer." She looked at the cottonwood trees and the creek and the wide, flat space. Then she looked at Leland. "It's beautiful," she said. "Yes," he said. He was not looking at the land. He was looking at her. She felt her breath become a complicated thing. "I want to build something here," he said. "A separate house on this piece close enough to the ranch to be part of it, but different. New." He was being careful with the words in the way he always was when something mattered a great deal to him. "I want to know if you think it's a good piece of land." "I think it's a wonderful piece of land," she said. He nodded. He reached into his coat pocket and took out something small and held it out to her on his open palm. It was a ring, a simple gold band with a small, pale stone set in it, not elaborate, but entirely beautiful in its simplicity. "I have loved you," he said, "since roughly the day you picked up the book I threw across the room and walked back to the chair and sat down. I think I knew it before I was willing to know it." He looked at her very directly, the way he always did when he was saying something true. "I'm not an easy man, and I don't expect to become a simple one. But I promise you I will be an honest one for as long as I live, if you'll have me." Clara looked at the ring in his palm and at his face above it, and at the cottonwood trees and the evening sky and the whole enormous weight of the life she had built around protecting herself from exactly this kind of hope. "Leland," she said. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said. Every possible yes. He put the ring on her finger and she put both hands around his and held them, there in the evening light, and neither of them said anything for a while, and neither of them needed to. They were married in September, in the Millhaven church with the sheriff and his wife and Dr. Ferris and Mrs. Harrington and half the town watching. And Clara wore a dress the color of cream that her sister had sent from Kansas when Clara's letter had arrived. And Leland wore a suit that looked as though it had been purchased for the occasion and perhaps slightly fought with on the way to the church. And when the pastor asked if he took this woman, his yes came out with so much conviction that Mrs. Harrington, who was not a sentimental woman, had to press her handkerchief briefly to her face. Her sister Ellen came from Kansas for the wedding, arriving 2 days before and taking one long look at Leland Cross, and then turning to Clara with an expression that mixed approval and wonder and something that looked very much like relief. "You look like yourself again," Ellen said quietly when they had a moment alone. "The way you looked before Fort Worth, before all of it, I didn't think," she stopped. "I'm glad." "So am I," Clara said, "more than I can say." Ellen met Leland at supper the night before the wedding, and interrogated him with the systematic thoroughness of an older sibling who has watched someone she loves be hurt and has decided to take absolutely no chances. Leland answered every question with the patient directness that was native to him, and by the end of the meal, Ellen had the expression of a woman who has made a careful assessment and arrived at a satisfying conclusion. "He's exactly what he looks like," Ellen said afterward. "A man like that is worth a great deal." "I know," Clara said. "Don't let him forget it," Ellen said. "And don't let yourself forget it either. You deserve this. You've always deserved this." Clara held onto those words through the ceremony the next day, when the pastor was reading, and the sunlight was coming through the church windows in the long slanted bars of a September morning, and she was standing beside Leland with her hand in his, and the feeling moving through her of something settling into place, something that had been moving and uncertain for a very long time finally arriving at where it was meant to be. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the Cross Ranch. Her ranch now, she reminded herself, which took some getting used to, and the hands had set up tables in the yard, and Mrs. Harrington had organized the food situation with her customary authority, and there was music from a fiddle player one of the hands knew, and the whole thing had the quality of a celebration that was genuinely wanted rather than merely performed. She danced with Leland in the yard, which was an experience, because he danced the way he did most things, with absolute attention and a kind of careful, determined effort to do it right. He was not a natural dancer. He was a man who danced because the woman he loved wanted to dance, and that made it something better than natural. "You're counting steps in your head," she said. "I am not," he said immediately. "You are," she said with a smile. "I can see it." He looked down at her, and the expression that moved across his face then was one she had come to love more than almost anything. The one where the careful, controlled exterior gave way to something that was purely and entirely him. Only the first three, he admitted. After that, I'm following you. She laughed. He watched her laugh the way he always did, as though it was something that genuinely delighted him. Good, she said. That's exactly the right approach. They moved to the new house on the Perkins land the following spring, after Leland had purchased the parcel, and spent the winter supervising its construction, with the same meticulous attention he brought to everything. The house was not large, but it was well built and thoughtful. He had asked her what she wanted in it, and then actually built those things, which she had discovered was not as universal a practice among husbands as one might hope. She had asked for a room with good light for reading, and he had built her one facing east with 2 windows, and he had filled its shelves with every book she had ever mentioned wanting, and several she had not mentioned, but that he had, on some level, known she would love. She stood in that room on the first morning in the new house and ran her hand along the shelf and felt something in her chest so vast and quiet that it was difficult to contain. She heard him come up behind her, and his hands came to rest on her shoulders. "Is it right?" he asked quietly. "It's perfect," she said. "Leland, it's absolutely perfect." She felt him exhale against her hair, the slow release of a man who has been waiting to know something and has now been told. "Good," he said. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm that was busy and real and occasionally challenging, and underneath all of that, deeply good. She continued teaching in Millhaven for the first year, riding the 3 miles to town on the mornings she was needed, because the children still needed her, and she was not willing to leave them without someone who cared. Leland never once suggested she should stop. He was proud of her work in the way that she was proud of his, with the specific pride of a person who understands what a thing costs and loves the person for doing it anyway. He read in the evenings. She had made a reader of him, or perhaps had reawakened the reader that had been there before the ranch consumed everything else, and he read with the same focused intensity he brought to everything he cared about, and he wanted to talk about what he read with a hunger that she found both endearing and wonderful. Their evenings were full of conversation in the way she had always wanted evenings to be, real conversation, the kind that went somewhere. In the early autumn of their first year of marriage, she told him that there was going to be a baby. She told him in the kitchen, in the morning over coffee, which was not the way she had imagined telling him, but was simply the moment when she could not wait any longer. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, and watched his face go very still and then shift through several things in rapid succession: surprise, and then something very much like awe, and then a warmth that was so total it was almost overwhelming to witness. He came around the table and took her hands and looked at her with that gray-eyed directness that had been one of the first things she had ever noticed about him, when he was sick and burning and furious, and she was standing in his doorway with her heart hammering. "Clara," he said. "Leland," she said, "are you—" He stopped. "Are you well? Is everything—" "Everything is fine," she said. "Dr. Ferris confirmed it last week. I'm very well." He let out a slow breath. Then he brought her hands up and pressed them against his chest, against the warmth of him, and held them there. "I did not think," he said very quietly, "that I would have this, any of this." "Neither did I," she said. He kissed her forehead, and then her cheek, and then very gently her mouth, and she felt the extraordinary specific tenderness of a man who has been granted something he never entirely believed he deserved, and is managing the magnitude of it carefully. Their son was born in April, on a night when the wind was loud and the stars were invisible behind clouds, and Leland spent approximately 3 hours pacing the hallway outside the bedroom door before Dr. Ferris came out and told him it was over and everyone was fine. He went in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son with an expression so raw and unguarded that Clara, who was exhausted down to her bones, found herself unable to stop looking at him. They named the baby William Cross, for no reason except that they both liked it. He was born with a great deal of dark hair and an extremely forceful opinion about hunger, which he expressed loudly and frequently, and which Leland found unreasonably funny in a way that Clara, in the night watches, did not always share. "He has your stubbornness," she told Leland, at 3 in the morning when William was 3 weeks old and had been persistently awake for 2 hours. "He has your lungs," Leland said, which was not entirely fair but was accurate. She looked at him across the baby, at the lines of his face in the lamplight, still sharp, still bearing the marks of everything he had lived through, but different now in a way she could not entirely articulate. Lighter, perhaps, as though the weight he had been carrying had shifted or reduced. "You seem happy," she said. "I am happy," he said, with the simplicity that was the thing she most loved about him. No qualification, no hedge, no managed expectation, just the clean, direct statement of a fact. "So am I," she said. William grew into a child of considerable character, determined and curious and vocal about both qualities, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's love of words, which manifested by the time he was 2 in an astonishing capacity to repeat back anything he had heard, accurately and at significant volume, in inappropriate circumstances. Leland taught him the ranch. Clara taught him to read. By the time William was 5 years old, he was following his father around the south pasture with the focused attention of someone taking serious notes, asking questions with a frequency that might have been exhausting to anyone less patient. And in the evenings, he would come to his mother's reading room and climb into the chair beside her, and demand a story with a confidence that suggested he had never once considered the possibility of being refused. He was never refused. The years on the Millhaven land were good years, built on the kind of foundation that comes from 2 people choosing each other deliberately and daily, rather than simply arriving at a marriage through the momentum of circumstance. They had their difficulties, because real marriages do, and because 2 people who have each been hurt in the specific ways they had been hurt inevitably carry the evidence of those wounds into the closest relationship they have. But the difficulties were navigable because they had, from the beginning, agreed to be honest with each other about what they were feeling, and that agreement turned out to be more protection than either of them had expected. There were moments of flaring tension when Leland's instinct for self-sufficiency made him retreat into himself in ways that Clara found alarming until she learned to read them accurately, and understood that they were not the same as the withdrawal of a man who was leaving, but the withdrawal of a man who was trying to manage something large and would come back when he had managed it. And there were moments when Clara's habit of holding herself very still when something frightened her made Leland ask, with contained anxiety, if she was all right, because he was alert to the possibility of loss in a way that years of contentment had gentled, but not entirely erased. They were good years because of the truth-telling, and because of the reading, and because of the land, and because of William, and eventually because of the second baby, a daughter, born when William was 4, whom they named Frances, after Clara's mother whose name had been Frances, and who arrived in the world with her father's decisive gray eyes and an air of serene command that Leland said, privately to Clara, was going to be an absolute force of nature by the time she was 16. "She's already an absolute force of nature," Clara said, watching 4-month-old Francis fix the ranch hand-turner with a stare of regal displeasure at the sound his spurs were making. "Good," Leland said. "She'll be fine then." With 2 children and the ranch and the school, she had cut back her teaching but had not stopped, because the children of Millhaven still mattered to her, and she had become, over the years, a kind of institution in the town. The school teacher who had somehow also become part of the Cross family and who ran a small lending library out of the schoolhouse from her own collection. Their life had the fullness of something that has been genuinely inhabited rather than merely existed in. The 4th year in the new house, Sheriff Prentice came out to the ranch on a warm Thursday morning in June, and Clara saw the wagon from the window of her reading room and came downstairs with the particular alertness that official visits still triggered in her, even in the life she had now. Leland was already on the porch. "Aldous," he said. The sheriff climbed down from his wagon with the unhurried manner of a man who has no bad news but has something specific on his mind. He held out his hand to Leland and tipped his hat to Clara when she came out. "Just a visit," he said, which he always said. "Nothing wrong. I wanted to talk to you about the schoolhouse situation." The schoolhouse situation was that Millhaven had grown, not enormously, but consistently, over the past several years as more ranchers and farmers had settled the county, and the schoolhouse was getting crowded. The county was discussing building a second, larger building, and the conversation had arrived at the point where someone needed to lead the effort. The county commissioner thinks Miss Voss, Mrs. Cross, would be the right person, the sheriff said, looking at Clara, to head the committee. "There's some funding coming from the state for new school construction, and someone needs to manage the process. You've got the relationships and you've got the sense." He looked at Leland. "If you can spare her for the meetings." "She doesn't need me to spare her for anything," Leland said. "That's her decision." The sheriff looked faintly impressed. Clara looked at Leland with the warmth she had never quite gotten used to feeling, even after 4 years of feeling it regularly. "Yes," she said to the sheriff. "I'll lead the committee." Leland was beside her. He had been there for most of the construction meetings, not speaking much, because it was not his project but present, in the way that meant a great deal to her. "Your mother would have liked this," he said. She turned to look at him. He had never met her mother. Her mother had died when Clara was 12 and Leland was 16, but she had told him enough about Frances Voss that he had a sense of her. "Yes," she said. "She would have loved this." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him slightly, in the doorway of the schoolhouse she had built, with the sound of her students running through the new rooms and the September afternoon warm around them. "I keep waiting," she said quietly, "for some part of this to turn out not to be real." He looked down at her. "It's real," he said. "I know," she said. "I think I've almost convinced myself." "You've convinced me," he said, "and I was harder to convince." She laughed at that quietly, and he watched her laugh with the expression she loved, the one that was entirely unguarded. That winter, during the long evenings when the weather kept them close to the house, and William was in bed and Frances was asleep in her cradle, and the fire was going and the wind was loud outside, Leland started reading to her. She discovered this was possible by accident. She had picked up a book and then been distracted by something domestic and left it on the table, and she came back to find him reading it, and without looking up from the page he said, "Do you want me to read it aloud?" And she said yes, and he did. He had not her ease with it. Reading aloud was a skill she had been practicing since childhood, and his voice was not her voice, and he read with a slight deliberateness that reflected the fact that he was not performing but simply sharing. But it was one of the things she would always treasure, those winter evenings when the tables were turned, and she sat in her reading chair and listened to her husband read to her by firelight. "You started this," she said to him one evening when he had closed the book and they were sitting in comfortable quiet. He looked at her over the book. "What, all of this," she said, "by throwing that book across the room." He looked faintly embarrassed, which on his face was a very subtle thing. "I've thought about that. I know," she said. "You've apologized for it approximately 12 times. "It was not my finest moment," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it was the moment that made everything else happen. If you hadn't thrown it, I wouldn't have picked it up and sat back down. And then—" She gestured at the room around them, at the fire and the book and the house and the sleeping children and the whole accumulated reality of their life. He was quiet for a moment. "I remember looking at you," he said, "when you picked it up, thinking, 'Who is this woman?'" He shook his head slightly. "I'd given up expecting anyone to stay." "So had I," she said. "And then there you were," he said, "sitting down like you intended to stay until further notice." "I did," she said. "I intended to stay until further notice, and the notice never came." "No," he said, "it never did." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the way he had that first evening in the lamp-lit street of Millhaven, when he had been learning how to begin again. And she turned her hand over and held his, and the fire settled in the grate, and outside the wind was doing its enormous winter work across the Texas plain, and inside everything was warm and real and permanent. Their 5th year on the Millhaven land brought a change they had not quite planned for, which was a third baby. This one announced itself in February, which meant an October arrival, which Leland heard with the complicated expression of a man who is deeply glad and also doing arithmetic about harvest season. "The harvest will be done by the 1st of October, Clara told him. "I know that," he said. "You were counting," she said. "I was not counting," he said, and then, after a pause, "I was roughly estimating." She shook her head, smiling, and he took her by the hands and pulled her close and pressed his forehead to hers in the gesture that was one of his particular ones, the one that was entirely private and meant everything. "Clara," he said. "Leland," she said. "I'm glad," he said. "So am I," she said. The third baby was another boy, born on the 12th of October as predicted, after a harvest that was in by the 8th, which Leland noted with the satisfaction of a man who had been right about something important. And they named him James, after no one in particular, because they both simply liked the sound of it. He was born with Clara's coloring, lighter than either William or Francis, with brown hair and eyes that could not decide between green and gray, and eventually settled on both simultaneously. William, who was 6 by then, received the news of a second brother with measured assessment, as though determining whether this new variable would positively or negatively affect his life. Francis, who was 2, was interested in James for approximately 4 minutes, before losing interest entirely, and going back to following Leland around demanding to be shown how things worked. Leland, for his part, was extraordinarily good with Frances and her demands, which Clara found both touching and slightly amusing, given that the first version of him she had known had been a man who refused to let anyone near him. "You are a completely different person with your children than you were when I met you," she told him once, watching him patiently explain how the fence posts were secured to a 2-year-old who was not going to retain this information but whose questions deserved to be answered anyway. "I had good instruction," he said. "From whom?" He looked at her over Frances's dark head. "From you," he said simply. She felt that in the specific way she always felt his direct statements of feeling fully and without defense all the way through. The years layered on with the generosity of a life that has been built on something solid. William grew into the ranch the way he had clearly always been going to, with his father's instincts for the land and his mother's words for describing what he saw in it. And by the time he was 12, he was a genuine working part of the operation, which Leland managed with the care of a man who remembered what it was to be given too much responsibility too young, and was determined to let his son find his own pace. Frances grew into exactly what Leland had predicted in her cradle, a force of nature, self-possessed and incisive and capable of a directness that sometimes made the ranch hands visibly uncertain how to proceed. She read everything her mother put in front of her and demanded more, and she had opinions about what she read that were stated with a confidence that reminded Clara, with a feeling that was pure love, of her husband in the early evenings by the lamp in the sick room. James was the quiet one, the observant one, the child who said less than his siblings but retained everything. He had his mother's writer's instinct for sitting still and watching, and by the time he was 7, he was filling small notebooks with drawings and observations that were more sophisticated than his years should have allowed. Clara kept her reading room and her books and her library at the school. Leland kept the land and added to it carefully, buying parcels as they became available, until the Cross Ranch had grown to something impressive without having become something unmanageable. He was careful about that distinction, about the difference between growing something and overextending it, and it was one of the qualities in him that Clara most respected: his refusal to want more than he could properly tend. On an evening in the late autumn of the year their youngest child, James, turned 8, Clara was in her reading room when Leland came in and stood in the doorway with the particular look he had when he wanted to say something and was choosing his approach. She put down her book. "What is it?" He came in and sat in the chair across from her, the same chair that had been in every reading room they'd had, the one he had habitually occupied opposite her since the beginning. "Sheriff Prentice is retiring," he said. "I heard," she said. "In town yesterday." "He came to see me this morning," Leland said. "He wants to recommend me for the position." She looked at him. He was watching her with the careful attention he always brought to things that mattered. "He thinks, and I don't disagree, that the county needs someone with established standing and no particular political debts," Leland said. "Someone the ranchers and the farming families both trust." "And do you want it?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The fire in the small iron stove in the corner of the reading room made its quiet sounds. Outside, she could hear James's voice from somewhere in the yard, calling something to his brother. "I want to know what you think," he said. "I think," she said carefully, "that you have been running this land for 15 years and you have done it well, and it would continue to run well with a manager you trust. And I think that the county could do a great deal worse than Leland Cross as its sheriff." She paused. "But it would be a different life than the one we have." "Yes," he said. "It would. Busier," she said. "Harder in some ways." "Yes," he said. "Would you regret not doing it?" she asked. He thought about this honestly, the way he thought about everything. "I think I might," he said. "Then you should do it," she said. He looked at her. "You're sure?" "I am entirely sure," she said. "Leland, when have you ever known me to say something I'm not sure of?" The corner of his mouth moved. "Never," he admitted. "Then you have your answer," she said. He became the county sheriff in the spring, and he was, as Clara had been entirely confident he would be, exactly the kind of sheriff the county needed. He brought to it the same qualities he brought to everything: the honesty, the patience, the willingness to say directly what he thought, and the bone-deep sense of responsibility to the people who depended on him. He was harder than some of his predecessors on certain things. He had very little patience for the casual cruelties that the powerful sometimes inflicted on the less powerful, the injustices that frontier life sometimes papered over with the excuse of necessity, and more measured than some on others. Clara continued her school and her library and her reading, and she added to those things the particular work of being the wife of the county's most public official, which she managed with the same competent ease she brought to everything she decided to put her mind to. She knew everyone in Millhaven and the surrounding county, and they knew her, and her word carried weight that had been earned over years of genuine presence in the community. They had been in Millhaven for over a decade now. The town had grown and changed, and they had grown and changed with it. And the Cross family had become one of the fixed points in the landscape of the county in the way that certain families do, when they have been present and responsible and real for long enough. Clara was 41, and Leland was 49, and their children were becoming people in their own right, and the life they had built was solid and good and real in every way she had once been afraid to believe a life could be. On the evening of the 15th anniversary of the first night she had read to him in the sick room of the ranch house. She knew the exact date because she had, characteristically, kept careful note of it. She found him on the porch of their house in the long evening light, looking out at the land. She brought him coffee and sat beside him in the neighboring chair, which was what they did in the evenings when the weather allowed, and the children were not requiring immediate intervention. He looked at the ring on her finger, the simple gold band with the small pale stone that he had given her on the ridge overlooking the cottonwood trees, the way he sometimes did still, with an expression that combined pride and something more tender than pride. "You know what today is?" She asked. 15 years, he said. She looked at him. "You remembered." "I remember everything," he said quietly, "about those days." She thought about the first time she had seen him, gaunt and burning and furious, the book lying on the floor between them, the challenge in his gray eyes that was really, beneath the surface of it, nothing more or less than a man who had stopped believing anyone would stay. "I never told you," he said, "what I thought when the sheriff sent you." "What did you think?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land. "I thought, whoever this is, I am going to send them away as fast as possible, because I had already decided." He stopped. "I know what you'd decided," she said gently. "Yes," he said. "But what I thought when you walked in." He turned to look at her, and his gray eyes held all of the 15 years in them, clearly and without concealment. "What I thought when you walked in was that you were the most real thing I had seen in a very long time." "Real," she said. "Not performing," he said. "Not managing me, not afraid of me or sorry for me or trying to make me feel something I didn't feel." He shook his head. "Just there, entirely honestly there." "I was terrified," she admitted. "I know that now," he said. "I didn't know it then." "Would it have changed anything?" she asked. He thought about it. "No," he said. "What I saw was true anyway. Terrified or not, you were there." She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, the way she had that first night in the street, and he held hers in his, and the evening was golden around them and the land was quiet. "You healed faster than the doctor expected," she said. "He told me at the 6-week visit that he had never seen a recovery of that kind." "I had an incentive," Leland said. "The reading," she said. He looked at her. "You," he said. "The reading was just the reason to have you in the room." She felt the warmth of that settle through her the way warmth settles through you on a cold day, slowly and completely. She squeezed his hand. "Well," she said, "it worked." "Yes," he said, "it did." She thought of the first page she had ever turned for him, in the amber lamplight of the sick room, with his gray eyes watching her from the pillow, and her heart uncertain, and the whole improbable future of this unfolding before them without their knowledge. "Reader," she thought, with a smile she kept to herself. "I stayed."